Hello, my name is Zain Al-Ghazi. I'm a postdoctoral candidate at the New Political Economy Initiative, or NPEI, at the Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay. Welcome to the second seminar of Economic Histories of the Global South, a seminar series organized by the NPEI in collaboration with the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IITB. The NPEI aims to construct a structural vision of the Indian economy toward building an alternative socio-economic paradigm to neoliberalism. The Economic Histories of the Global South seminar series speaks to this initiative by bringing together economic, business, labor, and agrarian histories in an effort to build an integrated image of the Global South's past to inform its present and future. You can visit npei.in to learn more about the initiative and this seminar series. Today's seminar is the second of four seminars, which take place online on the last Thursday of each month from February to May this year. Today, we have a book discussion on Navyug Gill's book, Labors of Division, Global Capitalism and the Emergence of the Peasant in Colonial Panjab, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2024. We will first have Navyug introduce the book, after which we have comments by Tanya Matthan and Rajmohan Gandhi, followed by a short response by Navyug. Finally, we'll have 30 minutes for a general discussion. If you would like to ask a question to any of the speakers, please type it out in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen anytime during today's seminar. We'll start with Navyug's summary of the book. Navyug Gill is a historian of modern South Asia, focusing on questions of agrarian change, labor politics, caste hierarchy, post-colonial critique, and global capitalism. So over to you, Navyug. You have 30 minutes.
Hello, and thank you all for being here on this, Thursday evening in India and Thursday morning on the US East Coast. I'm glad to be in conversation with all of you. I want to first express my appreciation for those who made this event possible. So shukriya to Zain and Sonal for the warm invitation to be part of IIT Bombay's Economic Histories of the Global South seminar series. It's been absolutely wonderful to work with you over these past several months on everything from conception and outreach to logistics and execution. This is probably one of the best curated events I have been a part of, and the rest of the series looks amazing, so shabash to the entire team. I'm also grateful to Rajmohan and Tanya for agreeing to read the book and share their thoughts. To have such esteemed interlocutors is a real privilege. And of course, thanks to the audience for logging in. I do wish we could all be in the same room in Mumbai so I could see smiles and perhaps frowns, but I guess these virtual spaces will have to suffice for now. Before we go any further, I want to also mark the fact that we are living through an especially turbulent time, from the ongoing genocide in Gaza to reactionary elites pushing bigotry and profiteering to the erratic flailings of the empire I find myself in. No historical analysis of imperialism or capitalism or decolonization can be divorced from atrocities committed in our midst. I can only encourage everyone to confront this madness, to reject cynicism, and to insist on alternative ways of ensuring our collective well-being. So my plan today is to try to do three things. First, I'm going to lay out the main themes and questions of the book. Second, I will briefly explain the different chapters as well as some of the archival materials I worked through. And then I will conclude by gesturing to a few of the wider implications of the argument. Let me begin, however, by saying a little bit about what led me to this project. At one level, perhaps with any book, there is a personal dimension. As a child, I grew up in a Panjabi immigrant family in Toronto and would often visit my paternal village called Safuwala in the Moga district of East Punjab. Amid visiting relatives and sites, I was exposed to the peculiar tension between hearing claims of being a peasant, of being a kisan, being a jat, or from a kheti badi parivar, with the reality that much of the work of cultivation was being done with and by landless laborers. These would be Mazhabis, Jamars, and Bauriye, or migrants from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. So from an early age, not only was I uneasy with the claims of status and power, but I became aware of a deeper problem with the concept of the division of labor itself. On another level, my graduate training was steeped in social and cultural history alongside the history of ideas. The major themes revolved around resisting colonialism and critiquing Marxism within an implicitly all India framework. However, I found myself not encountering classic resistance in the archives, nor that many dogmatic Marxists in the recent literature. On top of that, the given all India framework simply did not work for Punjab. And I suspect it does not work for places like Tamil Nadu or Kashmir or Sindh or Manipur or maybe even Bengal. This is probably where I started questioning the questions I inherited. Finally, I must say that I am a product of the debates between Marxism and post-colonial theory, and have realized that there need not be a hard opposition between the two. Indeed, I presented versions of certain chapters at various conferences across the world. So there were the global capitalism folks, the caste and race people, the labor history wale, the Panjab and Sikh studies crowd, the post-colonial and subaltern types. Amid polite engagements, it seemed everyone was a little displeased. They would say things like, there's too many numbers, there's too much poetry, there's too many colonizers, there's too much Marx, and not enough of everything else. Over time, I learned to embrace these critiques and try to hold together a series of competing contradictions as I wrote and rewrote. It begins with Baba Faridji, a 10th century Peer whose verses are codified in the Sikh Guru Granth Sahib. He says, Frida loda dak bijoriyan, kikkar bijya jat, handya un katenda, Pedan loda pat. Farid, the cultivator, wishes for grapes, yet plants acacia trees. He is spinning wool, yet wishes to wear silk. To my mind, Farid is speaking to all of us across the centuries about the space between actions and aspirations, and how easily we get lost in the delusions that come from our own arrogance. The apparent simplicity of cultivation might not be so simple after all. With that said, this book investigates the history and politics of the emergence of the peasant and its implications for a new form of hierarchy in colonial Punjab. British officials regarded the region as the quintessential agrarian province inhabited by a uniquely diligent, prosperous, and martial race of cultivators. They understood the peasant to be, quote, the predominant unit of society, insisting that the most important consideration of all was to implement policies of agrarian improvement and upliftment. This discourse of what I term colonial benevolence was underpinned by an ostensibly moderate revenue demand and protective legislation, coupled with the massive expansion of canal irrigation and extensive recruitment into the colonial military. Such claims can be found in other contexts too, where select forms of patronage and infrastructure are used as signs of progress, regardless of their authoritarian conceptualization, implementation, and deleterious long-term impacts. At its center is the enduring notion that in much of the popular and even scholarly literature, that this peasantry experienced nearly a century of unparalleled prosperity. Yet the narrative of a benevolent colonialism championing a stalwart peasantry is belied when examined through the prism of how caste, labor, and capital transformed the equation of rural power. The claim that peasants remained unscathed, if not strengthened, takes for granted both the category peasant and the nature of agricultural production, as well as the intent and operations of the colonial state. At a deeper level, it normalizes particular class and caste hierarchies by presupposing a continuity of relations from the pre-colonial through to the colonial and post-colonial periods. One indication of this process is the dominant interpretation of land ownership in contemporary East Punjab. According to the 2011 census, over 30% of the population are Dalits, mainly of the Chamar and Mazhabi castes, the highest proportion in all of India. Despite mostly engaging in cultivation, they own less than 2% of the total cultivated area. Instead, the bulk of land is held by members of the Jat caste, which account for about a third of the population. A similar situation exists in the rest of pre-1947 Punjab, in Haryana and Himachal Pradesh in India, and to an extent in West Punjab in Pakistan. Such disparities are usually explained through the ahistorical equating of identity with occupation. So Jats are peasants, while Chamars and Mazhabis are simply leather workers and sweepers. The post-colonial distribution of power in the countryside is thus reinforced by colonial assumptions about the inherent and timeless quality of rural Punjabis. I challenge the givenness of this agrarian order and the denial of its modern transformation by asking three questions. How did colonial racial, fiscal, and legal policies align the category peasant with hereditary caste identity? What kinds of contestations over collective status, access to credit, and land ownership did this generate among different groups of Punjabis? And what did this mean for the ways global capitalist processes became implicated in local forms of knowledge and power? This book uncovers the tangled politics of how and why colonial officials and ascendant Panjabis together disrupted existing conceptions of identity and activity to generate a new form of hierarchy masked as traditional. The result was the creation of a modern group of hereditary caste-based landowning peasants, alongside other groups engaged in cultivation yet relegated to the status of landless laborers. Now, writing a history of the division of labor opens up possibilities for rethinking the conventions of at least three venues of historical research. The first is that this book questions the very category peasant. Perhaps the most durable figure in modern history, peasants have long been a font for a vast assortment of arguments in every discipline in the humanities and social sciences. Dedicated publications such as the Journal of Peasant Studies rose to prominence in the 1970s due to the increasing importance of their object of inquiry. Indeed, it was armies of largely peasant soldiers that toppled governments and empires in places like China, Cuba, and Vietnam, as well as sparked insurgencies in places like Naxalbari. More recently, in 2020, the peasant dramatically reappeared in the Indian public imagination with a massive protest against a set of neoliberal farm laws, leading to an outpouring of new activism and writing. Still, underlying much of this literature is the notion that the peasant simply existed everywhere, a general, if not generic figure, traced backward from modernity to the recesses of primordial times. Yet these two claims, ubiquity and antiquity, ought to give us pause. The obviousness of the peasant is precisely what demands a re-examination in terms of what this category meant in different historical contexts, which groups came to occupy it, and how that shaped not only rural political economy, but what we think we know about the past. The taken for granted status of the peasant is thus itself an element in its historical emergence. This book also calls into question the centrality of the colonizer-colonized divide for histories of the colonial world. Such a stark, totalizing binary was in fact generated by the racial logic accompanying European conquest from the 16th century onward that regarded societies in Africa, Asia, and the Americas as inherently inferior. While anti-colonial movements inverted this logic as part of their struggle to resist and expel foreign domination, generations drew on this inheritance to contest the justifications of colonialism by demonstrating that colonized people were rational, dynamic, and worthy of freedom. Yet as Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire trenchantly remind us, there have always been doubts about the presumed unity and coherence of those deemed colonized. Not only did certain elite local actors ally with European powers, but others partially benefited in limited ways from colonial rule, while internal fissures over class, caste, religion, ethnicity, gender, and language were fitfully subsumed, though never silenced, as part of most mainstream anti-colonial nationalisms. This book confronts the chimera of the colonized by foregrounding the competition and contradictions that developed within Panjabi society during the 19th and early 20th century. It is therefore not another account of colonial subjects versus foreign colonizers, an instance of heroic peasants fighting against the British Empire. Instead, I explore how British rule generated a sustained, multifaceted, and unpredictable societal conflict from which certain groups emerged atop a new hierarchy to the exclusion and exploitation of others. Racial unity might be every bit as hollow as racial inferiority. Lastly, this book offers an alternative genealogy of global capital. If the transformative quality of the bourgeois mode of production is indisputable, the debate over its provenance, essential features, and trajectory has been equally inconclusive. Over a century of political and scholarly writings have, in various ways, explored what actually constituted capitalism proper, how and where it began, and what it then meant for people in different parts of the world. Much of this revolved around competing interpretations of the oeuvre of Karl Marx alongside the supposedly exemplary experience of Western Europe. At the same time, it is not insignificant that the entire literature on modes of production, encompassing people like Ashok Rudra, Utsa Patnaik, and Andre Gundu Frank, among many others, began with a dispute over the status of the peasant during the so-called Green Revolution in Punjab. Rather than attempt to clinch this debate or dismiss it out of hand, I take inspiration from the diversity of perspectives and embrace the contingency it suggests as inherent to all forms of radical change. This requires drawing on Marx differently, not as an authoritative means to adjudicate the truth of capitalism, but as a historical figure offering profound and penetrating yet inescapably elliptical insights into the world he was able to witness. As Antonio Gramsci remarked, Marx foresaw the foreseeable, and not everything everywhere and for all times. The burden of expectations, of capital to behave in universal ways, and of Marx to provide universalist answers is called into question by attending to the specificity of the transformation of colonial Panjabi society. This book's point of departure is to engage in the temptation of comparison without smuggling in a modern version of the scale of civilizations. Far from a simple criticism, I try to think with as well as across and through Marx to make sense of a distinctive global context. Perhaps the final contribution of the book lies in its scope as well as approach toward sources. At first glance, much of what I rely on will appear familiar to historians of colonialism and agriculture. There are settlement reports, government circulars, famine commissions, census data, and legislative acts. I also make use of less common materials such as dictionaries, statistical surveys, Christian missionary texts, newspapers, and Panjabi proverbs. That old adage about interpretation, that two scholars can reach different conclusions from the same piece of evidence, should be conspicuous. My aim has been to critically engage this conventional archive by contrasting it with other kinds of sources, as well as posing different kinds of questions. On the one hand, in the course of research, I uncovered certain untapped materials, from vernacular petitions for changing status, to a contract between a landholder and a laborer, to intimate details about family consumption patterns. On the other hand, I draw on Sikh and Bhakti sacred verses, as well as insights from individuals such as Bhimrao Ambedkar, Manguram, Harnam Singh Ahluwalia, Muhammad Hayat Khan, and Kapoor Singh. Near the end of the book, I analyze the writings of Marx alongside Adam Smith, Vladimir Lenin, and Karl Kautsky as theory rather than history. A non-Europeanist engaging with European thinkers is a deliberate gesture of refusing the boundaries of both discipline and geography, especially when those ideas have so profoundly shaped regions such as South Asia. Indeed, monopoly has no place in scholarly inquiry. Now, let me give you a sense of what's going on in the different chapters. In chapter 1, I excavate the wayward logic of colonial benevolence through the politics of revenue, knowledge, and culture to offer an alternative history of capitalism. Here, I analyze qualitative and quantitative data from various settlement and revenue reports alongside the standard account of accumulation in Europe. British officials use the idioms of caste, tribe, and religion to identify certain groups as peasants, giving them exclusive ownership of parcels of land, along with the responsibility to pay taxes to the state in cash. This is the opposite of what Marx describes in Capital Volume 1, where tremendous violence was used to dispossess and displace English peasants from the countryside into cities as a precondition to industrial capitalism. In Punjab, however, peasants were entrenched rather than separated from their villages, inaugurating a distinct form of accumulation through attachment. Chapter 2 explores the discrepancy between pre-colonial understandings of cultivation amid attempts by the colonial state to define and order rural Punjab. Put differently, I trace how the question, who is a peasant, was both asked and came to be answered for the first time. This places census forms, dictionaries, and grammars in conversation with proverbs, legislative acts, and rare local petitions. In particular, by intertwining identity with occupation, the Panjab Alienation of Land Act of 1901 produced a definition of an agriculturalist based on a mixture of originary descent, caste membership, and a verifiable claim to landholding in order to restrict access to the land market. In this way, Punjab's political economy was invested with a new, legally enforced caste-based hierarchy. In Chapter 3, I examine how and for whom rural debt developed into a problem, the conflicting outcomes of the way it was addressed, and the politics of what was naturalized and elided in the process. This brings statistical data, government reports, and legal judgments to bear on untapped vernacular memorials and household budgets. A prolonged debate involving British officials and Punjabi elites over legislative intervention transformed the problem from general debt to land transfer to a certain kind of alienation by undisciplined agriculturalists. As indebtedness became defined as a function of the poor management of resources, its remedy was a paternalism based on managing supposedly habitual profligacy. As a result, I demonstrate how notions of cultural extravagance and irrationality were used to conceal the new volatility structurally built into the agrarian economy. Chapter 4 explores the politics of emancipation through the problem of so-called lower castes freeing themselves from Brahminical Hinduism, but not the constraints of casteism or lowliness in the early 20th century. I draw on a wide range of sources, from early ethnographies, census figures, and medieval poetry to village surveys and a unique rural labor contract. The chapter begins with Ambedkar's aborted 1936 speech calling on Dalits to leave Hinduism to achieve emancipation. By this time, however, many had already converted in large numbers to other faiths such as Sikhi, Islam, and Christianity, and even started their own called Ad Dharma. From 1881 to 1931, the percentage of Hindu Chamars and Chudas dropped from 68% to 47% and 58% to 24% respectively. Yet they still experienced myriad forms of subordination and exclusion as a result of being exploited as rural menial laborers. This shows how a new caste-based hierarchy developed through the economy as opposed to the religiosity of untouchability operating under colonial capitalism. Finally, chapter 5 charts the career of the peasant as an object of global intellectual inquiry in tandem with the proletariat. How did it come to be invested with notions of deficiency and an expectation to change? And what did this mean for its trajectory in South Asia, apparently diverging from Europe? This perception, I argue, was based on the foundational claims made by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, where he deploys a series of comparisons, assertions, and extrapolations to assemble what I call a theory of peasant inadequacy. The rural peasantry served as the deprived opposite of urban workers in order to valorize the superiority of manufacturing over agriculture, which became the true measure of wealth. Smith's ideas about the archaic and inferior nature of the peasantry traveled to the colony, where British officials regarded regions like Panjab as backward and its people as innate peasants in need of tutelage and upliftment. Such depictions became embedded in the social and material structures of Punjabi society through the juridical, fiscal, and racial instruments of colonial rule. This is why I argue modernity in Punjab, and perhaps elsewhere, is premised on the birth of the peasant as we now know it. I try to show how the domains of culture and economy were disrupted and reordered to produce a new set of relations, processes, and hierarchies. Studies of colonialism have usually segregated the two. So you have writings on knowledge practices, social categories, and popular perceptions remaining apart from cropping patterns, debt ratios, and household expenses. Cultural politics are dissonant with the politics of economic life, an intellectually and historically untenable divide. This book proceeds differently, starting with a challenge to the dominant premise of a stalwart and self-evident peasantry enduring and even prospering under a benevolent colonialism. Rather than inverting this theme by insisting on immiseration and underdevelopment, I have attempted to bring the history of the ideological and material conditions involved in making such an assumption to the fore. Certain caste groups became relatively empowered through the designation of agricultural tribes and gained exclusive access to a new land market, while others were made into menial laborers, denied entitlements to ownership and resources. These processes produced the figure of the hereditary landowning peasant and positioned it at the top of a novel yet volatile capitalist agrarian order. The habit of automatically referring to unmarked aggregate groups, Panjabis and Indians as much as Nigerians, Chinese, and Brazilians, should no longer be acceptable. Together, these varied themes demonstrate the contestations inherent to one of the most naturalized features of society, the division of labor. The lucid serenity of the phrase itself conceals a world of struggles, both grand and quotidian. This historical logic is captured in Smith's statement from The Wealth of Nations. He says, quote, "To cultivate the ground was the original destination of man." In other words, the originary and masculine status of agriculture and its linear progression is fundamental to the political imagination in the West. I have attempted to show that in fact there was nothing inevitable about the nature of rural hierarchy in even the most celebrated province of the British Empire. At the same time, this book has provided an opportunity to revisit understandings of both the expectations and operations of capital in the colonial world. With an awareness that capitalism does not produce uniformity across the globe, differences in the political economy of Punjab cease to be signs of inferiority or remnants of backwardness with a given trajectory towards correction. Agriculture and the relationship between peasants and laborers were neither vestiges of a frozen pre-colonial culture, nor variants of a feudalism marked by stagism, the semi, the quasi, the pseudo, the pre. By demonstrating the historical production of these differences, not only is their fixity undone, but so too is the perception that they are mere impediments to a preordained future. Indeed, part of my argument is that the specific emergence of the Panjabi peasant precludes its inclusion within the rubric of a worldwide and trans-historical peasantry. Instead, I have described how an accumulation of attachments provided certain castes with land ownership, while juridical processes aligned identities with occupations, and fiscal policies restricted access to the market, all amid a discourse of paternalism which naturalized the new volatility of the agrarian economy. Marx, too, points to the specificity of this sport of transformation. He says in Capital, quote, "Men made clothes for thousands of years, under the compulsion of the need for clothing, without a single man ever becoming a tailor." In Panjab, fields were plowed, crops grown, and grain harvested for centuries without a fixed notion of the peasant. That subject, singular, exclusive, masculine, caste-based, emerged only at the particular juncture of colonial technologies of rule, instigating an internal struggle for primacy among different groups of Punjabis. Perhaps another more diffuse contribution of the book lies in its reinterpretation of the nature of hierarchy through the prism of history. Contemporary Punjab on both sides of the 1947 border is riven with a myriad of divisions as well as entanglements and aspirations shared with many other parts of the world. Struggles over land ownership, caste conflict, and gender roles take place alongside religious polarization and ecological degradation amid competing designs from New Delhi and Islamabad. At the same time, East Punjab in particular has an unmistakably egalitarian public culture drawing on its radical Sikh heritage, along with one of the lowest reported rates of caste-based crimes in comparison with other states in India. Beset by crises, its cultivators are nevertheless far from the brink of disappearance. Indeed, they are actually protesting on the borders of Delhi as we speak. Debates abound on redefining the future of agriculture while recognizing that following the supposed path of Europe is neither possible nor desirable. All of these issues are further implicated in global circuits of capital, from shaping the commodity prices of wheat, rice, and cotton to turning human beings into commodified migrants for the pitiless economies of the West. The results are hardly distributed evenly. Certain groups find ways to benefit, while others are excluded and exploited. Yet the overriding explanation of these hierarchies, of class, of caste, of nation, is the simple persistence of beliefs and practices from time immemorial, at most unfortunate, but by and large inescapable. Through this book, I suggest a more recent and therefore less permanent inheritance. Shorn of the solidity of antiquity, the peasant, along with the splintered logics of colonialism and capitalism from which it emerged, are made to confront the mutability of modernity. By giving this division of labor a history, I've tried to make clear that it was neither timeless nor inevitable, and thus will not last forever. The power of demonstrating historical change is therefore to bring contingency and unpredictability to our understanding of the past in the making of the present, in order to at least create spaces to think through different possibilities for forging emancipatory horizons. Perhaps, as Baba Farid indicated at the very beginning, one must have humble faith that the ultimate reward for effort lies beyond its immediate outcome. Thank you very much.
We'll now move on to Tanya. So Tanya Matthan is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Environment at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Los Angeles, and an MA in sociology from the University of Delhi. Her current book project, The Monsoon and the Market, examines experiences of risk among agriculturalists in rural central India. So, Tanya, you have 20 minutes for a response.
So I want to start by thanking both Navyug and Zen for inviting me to participate in the discussion. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here and to be in conversation with scholars whose work I really admire. And to begin, just to say again, congratulations to Navyug on this exceptional book, which is both empirically rich and detailed and theoretically ambitious. So I should begin with a small disciplinary caveat, which is to say that I read this book with a great envy of historians and a longing for the kind of close reading, rigor, and accumulation of detail that is evident in this book. And I also read it, as Zen just mentioned, as an anthropologist who currently works in a geography department. And I was especially struck by Gill's ethnographic sensibility and thick description. The book takes us through dense statistics and complex legal cases, as well as vividly recounted stories and detailed explanations of devotional songs. So in many ways, it serves as, I think, a model of historical anthropology, which many will hope to emulate in the coming years. It is also, I should note, beautifully and clearly argued. And what I really most appreciated about the book is how carefully Navyug lays out his arguments, and also how seriously and generously he engages with a range of scholars from Adam Smith to Ambedkar. This range of intellectual conversations is made clear in the book's wonderful title, highlighting the labors entailed in producing an agrarian division of labor and laborers in Punjab, particularly the suturing of the category of the peasant to hereditary caste identity, but also more broadly referring to the production of various kinds of ideological and material divisions between agricultural and non-agricultural tribes, between caste groups, and between peasant and proletarian. So the book raises a number of crucial questions that speak to multiple themes and fields of inquiry, including caste formation, colonial knowledge, agrarian transformations, indebtedness and land alienation, market discipline, and more. So given the vast scope of this study, I'm afraid some of my comments will not do justice to its nuanced theoretical contributions and empirical detail, and in fact might sometimes paper over some of these very fine-grained and complex arguments. But my comments today will just attempt to outline some of what I saw as the key ideas of the book and point to some themes about which I would love to hear more, or where some more explication and clarification would be helpful. So to begin, the book challenges conventional historical thinking on many fronts, but most centrally, it focuses on one core concept, the category of the peasant, which has been, as Navyug just mentioned, at the heart of multiple debates in the social sciences and humanities. So since its inception, a core element of peasant studies literature in particular has been the question of peasantness itself. Do peasants constitute a distinctive social type, a category relevant to diverse contexts, and a category with certain essential qualities? As a term, the peasant has variously referred to the rural poor, to serfs, to sort of simple and rustic people, and to subjugated groups. The category is analytically, empirically, and politically overflowing with meaning. A group of people at once castigated, romanticized, and revered. Gill, however, shows us that the peasant is anything but a relic of the past, but rather a political and economic subject born of specific and contingent historical processes, a product, he writes, I quote, of the distinctive yet entangled forces of colonialism and capitalism. Analyses of agrarian South Asia have often assumed a simplistic alignment between occupation and identity, suggesting that certain caste groups own most land because they are agriculturalists, while others own far less simply because they are laborers. Gill, however, shows us that it is through colonial technologies of rule, from the census to law, revenue reports to irrigation projects, that cultivation came to be conflated with caste and land ownership, congealing the diversity of agrarian relations and labors into a fixed definition of a land-owning, hereditary caste peasant or kinsan. In Panjab, therefore, capitalism did not destroy the peasantry, but rather produced it. Through this, Gill offers us a powerful reconceptualization of Marx's primitive accumulation and David Harvey's accumulation by dispossession, both of which tend to assume a transition from agriculture to industry that is applicable everywhere. In Panjab, Gill argues, capitalism, however, emerged through what he calls an accumulation by attachment. In the colony, peasants were not forcibly removed from the land, but tied to it in often rigid, stultifying, and exclusionary ways. But of course, this also entails certain kinds of dispossession, particularly of those deemed to be laborers and laboring castes who were effectively severed from any claims to the land despite their intensive labor on it. So while the peasant in Europe has always been understood in relation to its assumed opposite and its apparent future, the industrial worker, the peasant in Panjab, Gill tells us, can only be understood in relation to its separation from the agricultural laborer or mazdoor. So while Gill carefully examines the writings of key scholars of the so-called agrarian question, such as Karl Kautsky and Vladimir Lenin, reading their work, as he just noted, as theory rather than history, I'm interested in how this book speaks to some of the core questions within agrarian studies through the strong challenge to the ubiquity and antiquity of the peasant that marks so much of the work in this field. So early scholarship in this field, for instance, focused on the question of capitalist transformation of agriculture and implications for agrarian class structure. But more recent work has extended these discussions to, for example, the agrarian question of land, which examines the centrality of land control in shaping contemporary power and property relations in the countryside. There's also been important work on the agrarian question of labor, which debated whether small farmers could be called peasants at all or agrarian labor, and so on. So given the richness and continued vitality of this field, I'm eager to think more about how your rich historical work might challenge or extend or speak to this field of study. And moreover, if the original agrarian question was not simply about agrarian relations per se, but also the place of agriculture and the countryside within capitalism as a whole, in order to transcend capitalist relations, how then does the Labors of Division as a book allow for a broader and different understanding of agriculture, but also capitalism as a whole in South Asia and beyond? The second and related point I want to highlight is the book's argument around the relationship of caste to colonial capitalism. So you cite the work of scholars such as Nicholas Dirks, who've challenged the timelessness and uniformity of caste dynamics across South Asia, and instead emphasize the ways that colonial rule ossified and congealed caste relations and identities in ways that facilitated their projects of governance. At the same time, you argue that these critical accounts often overlooked questions of exploitation and exclusion. On page 192, for instance, you write, and I quote, "Caste identity may have been imagined or manufactured, but it continues to be a potent weapon in the arsenal of perpetuating economic disparities," end quote. Here you're building on as well as departing from work on colonial knowledge and caste formation, but I would love to hear more about your specific point of departure. You powerfully refute that caste is solely customary or religious, but instead situated squarely within questions of labor and political economy. Interrogating the labors of division, of course, immediately invokes Dr. Ambedkar's famous statement on caste as not simply a division of labor, but a division of laborers. Yet much work on caste, as you note, has been concerned more with its historical development and its ritual prescriptions, and less with its economic aspects. That is, as you write, more concerned for the roots of these divisions rather than the fate of the laborers thus divided. So to me, your work is not really making an argument about the invention of caste per se, but rather about the particular tethering of caste identity to occupation and more specifically to land. A particular articulation of caste that enables some to claim the status of peasant or landowner and others to be relegated to the category of laborer, non-peasant, or landless. And I wonder how this sits with other work around caste and capital and labor and land, including, for instance, Dharma Kumar's book on land and caste in South India, in which she argues that landless dependents were ubiquitous throughout the Madras presidency, even at the onset of colonial rule, or Rupa Vishwanath's work, The Pariah Problem, which maintains that the agrarian political economic system in the 19th century and prior was fundamentally premised on hereditary unfree labor. As Sheetal Chabria has written, and I quote, untouchable status imbricated in both custom and contract all at once, and therefore caste and class all at once, gave caste-based poverty its durability, end quote. So in emphasizing its economic roots or in focusing on contract, do we perhaps risk losing sight of custom, or rather the mutual imbrication, as Chabria says, of contract and custom? And this also has important implications for anti-caste movements. For instance, you write in chapter 4 about the limits of the politics of conversion, wherein untouchable groups could at once convert to other religions outside of Hinduism and still be excluded and marginalized in rural society. Conversion did and does not sufficiently challenge caste because it does not address the political economy of caste and the agrarian hierarchy of rural Punjab. You cite, for instance, an exchange documented by the Wisers, a missionary ethnographer couple doing research in rural North India in the early 20th century, in which they recount how a village headman insists that lower castes remain lower caste regardless of conversion because of the work that they do. As such, this clearly demonstrates that an anti-caste politics cannot be separate from a politics of labor. And yet we've witnessed the durability of caste beyond the rural and the agrarian and into the city, as well as outside of particular forms of caste-identified labor. So in a context in which land and landlessness, work and non-work are fundamentally tied to caste, what might an emancipatory politics look like? Especially since land ownership and land rights, fundamental demands of social movements, are in fact, as you show us, inseparable from forms of caste oppression and labor exploitation. If the peasant in South Asia emerged in relation to the Mazdoor, as you write, then how do we envision progressive agrarian struggles that do not simply reproduce the figure of the hereditary landowning masculine peasant? And finally, I want to extend this set of questions further to think about the peasant as a political category. So I read this book alongside another quite different book on peasant struggles, which is a collection of essays by the anthropologist Mark Edelman, titled Peasant Politics of the 21st Century. In that book, Edelman adopts a quite different approach in that he emphasized the continued relevance of peasant politics in the 21st century, from the fields of Central America to the halls of the United Nations. That book aims to persuade readers that the term peasant can be eminently contemporary. But rather than a category of colonial governmentality, however, the peasant, he writes, is a label of self-ascription and a badge of pride for millions, an explicitly political subjectivity. Edelman's ethnographic research reveals that the peasant characterization is not so troublesome to those Central Americans who assume a campesino identity. He writes that it is not their essential or univocal identity, but a central part of a spectrum of possible social positions. To Edelman, the peasant is a meaningful political category, and the social movements he discusses are explicitly invested in forging broad coalitions among what they call people of the land, across the landless, smallholders, and farm workers. I raise this in part because you've written and spoken extensively about the massive farmer protests in India in 2020-21 and continuing to this day, led by farmers from Panjab and Haryana. In particular, you've remarked on one of the main slogans of these protests, Kisan Mazdoor Ekta Zindabad, or Long Live Farmer Laborer Unity. And you write elsewhere, and I quote, "We should see this as an aspiration, an organic attempt to forge connections among extremely fluid and difficult conditions," end quote. So the question for you then is, how does this historical legal construction of the peasant that you so painstakingly trace fit with the political and politicized category of the peasant that Edelman describes and that the farmer protests seem to aspire to? So I'll end my comments there, but thank you again to Navyug for this excellent book and to Zen and Sonal for organizing this discussion.
Thank you so much, Tanya. We'll now move straight on to Professor Rajmohan Gandhi. Professor Rajmohan Gandhi is a historian and biographer who taught for many years at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and has been a visiting professor at IIT Bombay. His latest book is Fraternity, Constitutional Norm and Human Need, published by Aleph in 2024. Rajmohan's Panjab, A History from Aurangzeb to Mountbatten, was published in 2012. Currently, he serves as editor-in-chief weareonehumanity.org. So, Professor Gandhi, over to you for 20 minutes.
I'm very happy to join all of you this occasion. 3 very brief initial remarks before I read what I've written. First of all, I'm very happy to raise the average age of participants by joining. Secondly, I was very glad that Navyug wanted us to be alert to what is happening right now in the world, especially in Gaza. I appreciated that. And thirdly, I wanted also to thank Tanya for her amazingly erudite comments. Now, as I look at the title pages of this book, I find powerful words and phrases. South Asia in motion, global something. Of course, colonial, peasant, a book addressing or involving these weighty words is likely to be, among other things, frightening. Let me say right away that Navyug Gill's book is not frightening. It is, however, formidable. You don't read this book in one sitting. It certainly demanded from me, close and attentive reading over a few days. Let me also say straight away that while this book addresses complex questions, it is neatly and elegantly written, even in places beautifully written. Tanya too has made this point, so please accept this old man's praise, Navyug. There is so much that you address in your book, or you touch upon. The British conquest of Panjab in the 1840s, taking place well after other parts of the subcontinent have been captured by the British. The history of 19th century Punjab, first 4 decades of 20th century Punjab, reports of colonial officers from different parts of Punjab, heated disputes between various white colonial officers, interesting changes in Punjab's demographics revealed by periodic censuses, of course, the caste question in different parts of Punjab, peasants owning land and rural Punjabis working on the land without owning any of it, money lenders who become landowners who become money lenders as well. You also touch upon courageous foes in Punjab over time, foes of hierarchy, foes of greed. You touch upon champions of fraternity and equality, people partaking jointly of common meals. You describe Panjabi foes of caste hierarchy who invite Ambedkar in the 1930s to provide a boost to their efforts, but who have already taken bold steps themselves against caste. You write of bhagats, of sants and poets like Ravidas, Namdev, Kabir. You, of course, recall Baba Farid and Bulle Shah, and, of course, Guru Nanak and the gurus who succeeded Guru Nanak. You write of Banda Bahadur. You tell us about the very interesting Mangu Ram of Hoshiarpur and about the serious consideration that Ambedkar gave to adopting Sikhism before he embraced Buddhism at the end of his life. You cross oceans, you cross land boundaries, You write of Karl Marx. You recover some of the ignored writings of Karl Marx. You write of Adam Smith. You write of Lenin. You write of Kautsky and others. You offer rich fare, stimulating fare, at times fare that was hidden. Overwhelmed by the intellectual feast you offer, a reader like me cannot always remember the questions for which your book seeks answers. Is the book primarily a history of colonial Punjab? A rural history of colonial Punjab? A sociological history of colonial Punjab? It is not a history of Punjab's partition. In fact, the movement for partition, starting formally in 1940, doesn't seem much to enter the story. Yet the Muslim League had been formed at the end of 1906. Separate electorates had been designed. Seeds for the two-nation theory had entered Hindu minds and Muslim minds. And sections of Punjabis, Hindu as well as Muslim, desired separation and practiced separation. The separateness in the aims and ambitions of undivided Punjab's Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs does not quite emerge from your study. Also, mostly absent from your story is the Punjabi soldier fashioned from rural Punjab by the colonizing power. Missing too are the carefully separated Muslim, Sikh, and Hindu camps and categories where this soldier was kept during colonial times. Other scholars have given considerable importance to this policy of separation in the army, including when trying to explain the killings of 1947, in which demobilized soldiers seem to have played quite a part. However, to the benefit of scholars and the general public, your study opens some thick and heavy curtains. We see the Panjabi village of colonial times, in its diversities, in its equations, in its conflicts. Yours is a revealing book. You bring out 19th century rural Punjab for us to see. Rural Punjab as revealed in periodic censuses, where jatis are named and professions are also named. And you seem to ask the excellent question, was a jati named after an occupation or a profession, or was the profession named after the jati of the people performing it? You employ the Panjabi word qaum, which Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus all seemed to use in the 19th century, qaum. You interrogate the censuses conducted by Punjab's and India's colonial rulers. Did a census consolidate jatis or qaums? Did it merely record living and functioning qaums, living and functioning jatis? In places, you seem to suggest that benefits available to a particular qaum or a jati, though not to another, could have affected a Punjabi's answer to the question of the census taker, what is your qaum? In the year 1776, Adam Smith, the Scotsman whom you discuss, as you also discuss Karl Marx and Lenin and Kautsky, presented division of labor as the real secret that lay behind the modern age of industry and the marketplace. That industrial age, of course, is well behind us. We've even gone past the postmodern age, the post-industrial age. With AI and much more, we are in a post-truth, post-facts age, an age of massive and instant image production and massive and instant image destruction, massive and instant information production, massive and instant information destruction. But that is a different subject altogether. Upturning Adam Smith's celebrated phrase from 1776, you call your book Labor of Divisions. I suspect that you're implying, among other things, that colonial Brits worked hard, labored hard to classify Punjabis by jati or qaum and to divide Punjabis by jati or qaum. You write, quote, colonial rule radically disrupted and reordered Punjabi's social and economic relations without replicating the dynamics of industrial society in the metropole, unquote. The British district or provincial officer in Punjab does not emerge from flying colors from Gill's account. But I ask this question, does this officer deserve some extenuation? Should we take into account the fact that this officer from England, Scotland, Ireland, or Wales, at times even from Australia, apparently haughty, arrogant in most cases, had probably landed in a new land when he was inexperienced, very young, on his own and fresh? Your reflections, Gill's reflections on what he calls, quote, the capricious career of the peasant as an object of intellectual inquiry, unquote, are very interesting. You write, quote, my argument here is that only with the rise of industrial workers in Europe did it become possible and indeed necessary to define and describe their opposite, rural peasants, unquote. And you add, quote, there were no peasants before the first cities, unquote. These are strong and provocative assertions and bound to trigger interesting debate. It is well known that in Panjab, following the British conquest, instead of the village or the community owning the land, individuals became proprietors, and the government made yearly settlements for revenue with owners of land. Apparently, classes of menials were created. Indirectly, at least, Gill's book suggests that imperial labors produced social division among Punjabis. Yet we must ask, did chudhas and chamars and other so-called low caste or so-called menials exist or not exist before the British came? Were they called chudhas, chamars? Was there an egalitarian society of Punjabis in pre-colonial Punjab? Did Muslim, Hindu, and Sikh societies in pre-colonial Punjab differ from one another? These questions are not for opinion polling or guess-making, but for historical inquiry. Analyzing and critiquing colonial Punjab is valuable, essential, but should not pre-colonial Punjab receive similar attention? Shouldn't there be a diligent and frank recovery of social, economic, and political realities of pre-colonial Punjab? In his study, Gill writes a sentence that to me seems quite important. Quote, the true task of history writing might be to give what appears as timeless a timeline. Page 253. Find real timelines, you seem to say. The Punjab of the 17th and 18th century, pre-colonial Punjab, undivided Punjab, is not, of course, timeless, but we are largely knowledgeless about that Punjab. That Punjab is very poorly known to us. Producing a truthful history of 17th century and 18th century Punjab, a truthful social, literary, cultural, economic, and political history of a Punjab of those centuries, a Punjab that includes the stories of areas that today we know as Rawalpindi and Ludhiana, or Lahore and Amritsar, Patiala and Bahawalpur, Jalandhar and Multan, Shimla and Maree, would not only be of immense interest, it might even push people to come together, to understand one another, to look at unaccustomed points of view, even, who knows, to heal relations. Gill seems to contend that because of the equality and fraternity taught by Guru Nanak and the other Sikh gurus, and more or less around the same time by Kabir, Ravidas, and Namdev, and earlier by Baba Farid, Punjabi society has over time grappled more boldly against hierarchy and indeed caste than other parts of India. Putting it mildly, this is a conclusion of some significance. Another significant and to me hope-giving fact, acknowledged in passing in Gill's study, is this. Punjabis have been making the whole world their home for a long time. Canada, Australia, the UK, the US, New Zealand, and other places are today in some ways Punjabi homes also. Punjabis have not colonized any other country, not in the sense of ruling over, dominating over another nation, but they have adopted distant places as their permanent home without losing their love or attachment for Punjab. What will be the result or fruit of the labors worldwide of Punjabis? This is one of the questions provoked by Gill's study. There's a related question. Are there learnings, are there lessons for today's global Punjabis, Sikh Punjabis, Muslim Punjabis, Hindu Punjabis living far from Punjab? Are there lessons for them from what the Brits did or did not do when during the 19th and 20th centuries they spent long periods in Punjab without, however, making Punjab their home? Reaching out as it does to Adam Smith, to Karl Marx, to Lenin and others, Gill's study reminds us that we live in a wide world of which India is but a part, a special part, no doubt, yet only a part. Gill does not touch on what to me is an intriguing question with which I will end. The question is this. Is Sikhism, or Sikhi, to use the term that Gill employs, is Sikhi solely and purely a Panjabi, Indian or Indic way of life or religion? Or does Sikhi also contain elements absorbed from traditions that may have begun elsewhere in the world outside India? Finally, thank you, Navyug Gill, for taking us to observation sites that offer fresh and sometimes unexpected views of mountains and valleys in the amazing history of Punjab. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Gandhi. I'd now like to call on Navyug to give a quick response to all the comments that he got. Navyug, you have 15 minutes for responses. It's okay.
Okay, wow. Well, I'd actually like to think about this and maybe come back in a week and then have the conversation. But I know we can't do that. I really appreciate these very rich comments and such a generous engagement with my book. If I wasn't Panjabi, I would be blushing red right now. But really, again, thank you to Tanya and Rajmohan ji. Let me try to respond to these provocations. I mean, one can't answer such questions, but I can give a sense of my response. And maybe I'll just, because I have so many pages and pages of things written, let me just maybe just go in order. It might be the easiest. I think from Tanya's questions, the first question you had about how the book might speak to agrarian studies and this long tradition of questions about the capitalist transformation of agriculture. I think one of the reasons, one of the ways I came to these questions actually was I'm very much indebted to that literature. I don't dismiss it. I don't take it for granted. I've read all of it and learned a great deal. I was actually struck by something that André Gunder Frank remarked, as we all perhaps know, in the 1970s. And he's a Brazilian economist and was sort of aware that at the time, a lot of radical economists in Brazil were trying to make sense of the poverty of Brazilian society and ended up at the point where they said things like, there's not enough capitalism in Brazil. And we need more capitalism to get rid of some of this, some of these depredations and backwardness. And it was at that point that André Gunder Frank made that remark that the historical role of the bourgeoisie is done. That this is not an aberration. This is not the lack of capitalism. The poverty in Brazilian society is a result of capitalism. It's just capitalism looks different here than what we think it's supposed to look like. So stop trying to invoke this classical sense of proper full capitalism, and instead confront the difference of our society. So I think that was a kind of enlightening, eye-opening moment for me, where I felt like there was a kind of parallel conversation happening in places in South Asia, where we still had this notion of semi-feudal, quasi-capital, pre-capital. We still had this kind of lingering, so much ink has been spilled actually debating whether or not it's feudal or semi-feudal or pre-capitalist or not. And I thought our burden is actually to confront the difference of our own societies and figure out what this is without some preconceived rubric that we have to kind of deploy. So I, in the sense, am kind of pushing up against a bunch of the tradition of kind of classical agrarian studies, but actually I'm implicated in it. It actually comes from that. And I think in some studies, some places have kind of overlooked this and sort of moved off in different directions, but especially in a place like Punjab, where the peasant is so celebrated, so invoked, historically, but even in sort of cultural, sort of pop references, I felt like this was something I had to contend with directly. To your second question about scholars of caste and people like Dirks and others, yeah, I think what I was concerned with in the book is to confront questions of caste, but I was sort of, again, aware in the literature about how a lot of depictions of caste were about its kind of symbolic, almost psychological dimensions, and categories of knowledge and discursive practices. And what I wanted to do was to try to bring the question of caste to bear, as you say, actually tethering it to class and occupation and land, and not just leaving it in the kind of realm of knowledge production. And so, people like Dharma Kumar, yes, I've learned a great deal and differ on this question of landless laborers existing in the 13th or 14th or 15th century. I think that question of landed and landless is a new question. Not to say people didn't have claims to land and had different kind of entitlements to land, but the notion of an exclusive owner of a parcel of land that is inheritable, that is based on certain caste qualities, this is very new, and its counterpart is the one that is excluded from any possibility of ownership. To my mind, this is very new, and it's born in this 19th and early 20th century period. From Rupa's a book and through my conversations with her, I've again learned a great deal. And I think what comes across in our conversations was actually the difference of Tamil Nadu and Panjab, and actually the hard binary of enslaved and brutalized and outright kind of subordinated people in that context, versus in Panjab, we have a kind of very, very different kind of situation. Somewhere in the text I mentioned a song by the radical poet Santram Udasi called Jat Te Siri Lahal, which to this day I find is a very provocative and kind of enigmatic song, because it talks about the Jat, the landholder, the Siri, the kind of attached laborer, but actually their intimacy and the fact that they're actually commiserating with each other about the fate of land being sold to money lenders and not having kind of control of what one produces. So there's a kind of hierarchy, but a kind of intertwined relationship at the same time. And I think that's hard to kind of fathom in other parts of the subcontinent. So that's kind of something about that distinctive history. And in terms of the way this kind of bears on contemporary struggles, I think, yeah, the difference between the Kisan and the Mazdoor that I'm talking about, that I'm exploring in this kind of 19th and early 20th century, turn of the century period, I think what happens after in the rest of the 20th century, actually there's significant kind of changes that take place that transform the question. So of course, as Rajmohan also mentioned, 1947 partition, the kind of civil war that took place, but also later the Green Revolution, so-called, and then later the liberalization of the economy. I mean, these things actually change the equation of power, I think, throughout the latter half of the 20th century, that make the issues that I'm addressing quite different from sort of the situation later on or in the 21st century. And I think this gets to your third question, just about campesino movements and actually the struggles in Latin America and how people have commented on it. And I agree that it is absolutely a meaningful political category, and it is a category of struggle. And as you mentioned, there's a struggle ongoing right now, and I've written about it. I think you've written about it. People have spoken about it. And so I think this is the difference between, say, scholarship and activism. And I want to insist on the difference between the two. They can be related, they can inform one another, but historical scholarship is not the exact same as activism. And if one is writing a scholarly text, it's different from the pamphlet. I think we should write both, and we should write many other things, but not conflate one with the other. So one can, I guess, explore the complexity of the figure of the peasant and the way it's embedded in a kind of new relationship between colonialism and capitalism, the hierarchy it produces, and at the same time see a kind of neoliberal onslaught that is trying to disenfranchise millions of people and imperil the livelihoods of perhaps hundreds of millions, and oppose that and insist on supporting that struggle. And so that I think that juxtaposition between history or even kind of anthropological studies with contemporary struggles is a productive one, and one can hold on to that and not be, I guess, not be pigeonholed into supporting a current struggle and therefore trying to find its antecedents in the past. Because when we look to the past, we might find things that are uncomfortable, that don't actually align with our current sensibilities. And we must have the, I guess, space to explore those things wherever they may lead. But we should talk more about this, because I think it's a useful thing to kind of try to make sense of together. To Rajmohan's comments, yeah, I mean, there's so much there, and let me just sort of touch on a few things. I mean, I think I really appreciate all that you've said, but especially, you marking my use of Farid and Kabir and Namdev and the Sikh gurus and others. I think one of my concerns was, as we sort of, secular historians dealing with kind of political economy, these things are generally not addressed. We don't really kind of draw on them. There might be some, of course, people in religious studies and other disciplines, of course, use them all the time. But for a kind of critique of capitalism and political economy, it's not really part of the conversation. And I wanted to spend time trying to think with people or figures like Kabir or Ravidas and Guru Nanak. Also, I feel sometimes, we will spend hours and hours, days, years trying to make sense of Adam Smith or Marx or Foucault or Derrida, and we have little patience for Namdev. And so I was trying to get my political economy readers to actually think through what might be said by these figures and how that might help us understand this 16th and 17th century period. The point about military recruitment, about consumption patterns also, there was a study, a board, something called the Board of Economic Inquiry, and they actually sent researchers out into the countryside and in the early 20th century, and they documented people's consumption patterns. And this was a kind of British-sponsored body. And they did this at a time when there was all this hysteria about wasteful spending and indebtedness, and how the paternal colonial state was going to save agriculturalists. And yet, if you go through all of those studies, what you end up finding is people are spending 70 or 80 or sometimes 90% of their income just to feed and clothe their members. And there are no entries for lavish feasts or festivals or wasteful expenditures of one kind or another. And what I've learned from that, or what I think that reveals, is how there's a new volatility that is naturalized in the early 20th century. We can call it capitalism or agrarian capitalism, but that volatility is what is concealed. And instead, the entire conversation becomes about how the colonial state intervened to protect peasants from evil moneylenders. And I think that language actually, not only does it conceal this volatility, but actually I think that language stays with us to this day. You still see headlines, from 2008 financial crisis, foreclosure crisis in the U.S. Right? Irresponsible people just don't manage their budgets well. They're not. They should know they can't afford houses like this, and so they fall into default and they go bankrupt, and it's their own fault. And so I think that's actually a kind of colonial logic that's been at play for a much longer time. Your point about the British officers and how to regard them, it's a very important question, and I've grappled with this for a long time, because on the one hand we have very rich officer ethnographies, right? These colonial officials in their spare time, waltzing through the countryside, recording their observations and documenting what they saw. We learn a great deal from those observations, not as actual history, but as what these officers thought they were seeing. And so they're invaluable. But at the same time, I felt a little bit uneasy with studies that focused on the kind of psychology of colonial officials and kind of their internal sort of makeup and what they ended up having a kind of empathy for these officers. Now, I don't believe in celebrating or denouncing, colonial officials. I mean, there's nothing much to that. But I also feel like one can't ignore the power of these 20-something men to go through the countryside and catalog their observations. And so that power is embedded in the kinds of things they saw. And today, as historians or scholars, we can kind of learn from that, but we can't conceal what it must have meant on the other side, to be living somewhere and have some officer show up on a horse and start asking you questions, and one has to give answers. There's something unnerving about that kind of demonstration of power, that performance of power. And so I wanted to kind of retain that. But as you mentioned, acknowledge the limitations and the kind of constraints these people faced. Two quick more points. I don't want to go over my time. The question you had about how do we think of Mazbis, or I guess Juras, as the offensive word is, and Jamars in the pre-colonial period. I think this is absolutely essential, and I agree with you that not enough work has been done giving kind of texture to 16th or 15th or 14th century Panjabi society, or even elsewhere, about the nature of hierarchy, the kind of exclusion and exploitation people faced. So I agree that there were these forms of hierarchy in the pre-colonial period. There is no need to kind of romanticize the pre-colonial past. One is not nostalgic of a kind of harmonious, equitable time before the present. But then also, I insist on marking the transformation under colonial rule and what makes hierarchy different in the 19th and 20th century. That it's not a kind of timeless hierarchy, that actually things change. And so part of that chapter on using Ravidas and Kabir and Guru Nanak is to show, if there is a critique of caste in the 15th or 14th century, that means there was a hierarchy, there was exploitation or exclusion that provoked these kinds of writings and struggles at that time. But then in the 19th and 20th century, actually the equation is different. Now we have a colonial state who is intent on deciding who is a landowner and who is not, and using all of the resources of racial logic and legal claims and fiscal policies to actually transform this equation. So I think one has to have, and maybe this is for other scholars absolutely to take up, that the 14th and 15th century texture of Punjabi society and hierarchy, and put that into conversation with 19th and 20th century struggles, and maybe trace those connections in a clearer way, which perhaps I haven't been able to do. And then that is, again, goes to your other question about the difference of Punjab and the way caste operates here. And this is actually what I tried to come to. When you read about the performance of caste, let's say, the operations of caste in other parts of South Asia, one often gets rather kind of stereotypical maybe exaggerated claims. But nonetheless, what comes across is a hard, stark binary, hard differences, prohibitions on touch, on sitting together, the logic of purity and pollution, the kind of animosity, the visceral disgust. Now, scholarship has kind of complicated these notions and sort of tried to contextualize them because they can seem a bit Orientalist even. But nonetheless, there is enough scholarship to show, and contemporary observations to show that visceral disdain practiced elsewhere. In Punjab, there is a difference. There is actually a qualitative difference. And there's no way around that. And I think that draws on Sikhi, and it draws on a longer kind of history of struggle. Things like langar, the institution of langar. I think it's remarkable in the sense of people contributing, cooking, eating, and cleaning together to explicitly transcend this prohibition on touch, on auspicious and inauspicious foods, and things like that. That there are cultural resources, there are religious resources as part of the texture of a society to confront this kind of bigotry and segregation. Again, not to end up in some kind of romantic, celebration and a denial of exploitation or hierarchy, but to mark specificity. And I think perhaps it is other regions have other kinds of resources and then therefore produce different kinds of histories. But for my sense, that's part of that difference on learning, on singing, on space, on touch, on eating, and the rest of it. Finally, maybe I'll just say that the question about migration, this is the open-ended question. I am kind of a migrant, I guess, myself, living in the US, growing up in Toronto. My parents were migrants from the 70s and have traveled in many different places. And the question of actually migration is now, thrown in a different political light with reactionary movements in many different countries. So I think we are in the process actually of redefining home and belonging. And contesting regimes that try to segregate people in new ways. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Navyug. So we have a number of really wonderful questions. So I think the way that we're going to proceed is that there are a set of questions for Navyug and Tanya, and then a set of questions for Navyug and Professor Gandhi, and then a final set of questions where everyone, I think, can comment. So let me first pose the questions which I think are for Navyug and Tanya to start with. So the first one is from Ashrita Murali. Ashrita asks, what role has risk and expectancy played in shaping agrarian politics in Punjab in the 20th century? What risks were there for farmers before the Green Revolution or current threats to the MSP regime? So that's the first question. The second question is from Sanjay Abraham, who asks, don't we need histories which integrate Indian agriculture and industry? Aren't the two linked? And the final question is from Amin Ashfaq, who asks, how have long-term weather and environmental patterns affected rural stratification in Punjab against other states in India? So those are the three questions, Navyug and Tanya. So Tanya, would you like to go first? Navyug spoke.
Give Navyug a little break.
Please.
Yeah, thanks so much, Navyug, for your responses and for these questions. I think, with the question of risk, I think I won't speak to the Punjab context. I'll leave that to Navyug, but certainly the question of how risk has shaped sort of agrarian society is a kind of fundamental one. If I'm reading the question correctly, it is on thinking about how it's shaped agrarian politics. Yeah. I think it's interesting because so much of agrarian policy in post-colonial India has been around managing risk and sort of tempering risk through things like the MSP regime and so on. But at the same time, it's been, I think, a process of exacerbating risk in other ways through, for instance, the introduction of sort of new cash crops, the ways in which farmers have been pushed into indebtedness and so on. And I think this goes to an important point that Navyug makes in his book, which is about the kind of broader context of market volatility introduced by colonial capitalism, which, created indebtedness and land alienation and so on, but which were often attributed to sort of the individual or the caste characteristics of particular groups as being sort of undisciplined or profligate or what have you. So I think that history is very important to understanding even the present day context of risk and what it means for farmers to kind of be positioned as both sort of at-risk subjects who need protection from the state, but also encouraged to be risk takers in other kinds of ways, through taking on more loans, through engaging with the market and so on. In terms of the other question about kind of weather patterns and climate and how that shapes rural stratification, I think that's an important question. I think more work needs to be done on this question of how these environmental changes, these weather changes might shape rural inequalities. I think, from early work on kind of climate change and its impacts, we're seeing that a lot of it is really sort of reproducing rural inequalities, right? Because the people who can most adapt or most sort of able to mitigate risks from climate change are often landowning castes who have also diversified into other kinds of occupations and therefore are able to manage these kind of climatic volatilities much better than sort of laboring classes who often have to work in the fields in incredibly difficult circumstances and so on. So I think we're seeing some of that work emerge, and it's really showing us that there's been a reproduction of these inequalities. But I think much more needs to be done. But I'll stop there and hand it over to Navyug.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is really a great set of questions, and I'm only going to actually just echo, I think, what Tanya said. I think to the first question about risk, I would add just a fundamental question about, is risk normal? We have a kind of predicament where for people that are engaged in cultivation, if you don't produce enough crop, you suffer. If you produce too much, you suffer, right? That logic that market prices are sacrosanct and normal, and one just has to kind of gauge the risk and make decisions as a kind of rational actor. This is what I think we should return to as a fundamental question. Is that normal? Is that the best way to organize life? Is that equitable? Are there other ways to decide what one does with their time, or how crops are grown, or how a society reproduces itself? So in addition to the historicizing the question of risk, but we should problematize, we should question that there's other ways to live. And I don't think any other segment of society would put up with such volatility. And yet we expect people engaged in cultivation to do so. The other question about industry and agriculture, are they linked? So yes, exactly. This is the conventional trajectory, that you have agricultural societies that transition into industrial societies. So that is the kind of inherited rubric. And what happens in places like South Asia is that we don't have industrialization. And so then everybody says, well, we're still stuck in kind of feudalism then. And we're sitting here waiting for a manufacturing economy, we're waiting for industrialization. When will it come? Until it comes, we're still mired in feudalism. And what I'm trying to say is actually that might not be the way to think about it. Instead of having peasants that turn into proletariat, here we have a kind of the absence of the proletariat. We have a kind of new peasantry, and we actually have to do the work of thinking through what it might mean. In geopolitical terms, and this is for the political scientists and others talking about actually manufacturing now vis-a-vis China and sanctions and tariffs and trade wars. But I think they can be linked, but the trajectory that we've inherited is not a blueprint. That's all I would insist on, that actually we have to think of these things anew. The last question about whether, absolutely, you're right about how it's actually going to become increasingly catastrophic, actually, for our region of the world, South Asia. And there's lots of new scholarship about this and political struggles. I mean, just in terms of Punjab, thinking about something like the water table and how, again, it was a regime of MSP that brought something like rice to a place that doesn't have a monsoon, doesn't have 7, 8, 10 inches of standing water in the summer. And the use of tube wells made rice sort of viable in Punjab. And right at the moment of its introduction, people are saying this is not sustainable, that this crop is going to damage our water table. We should not have this. And all of those pleas by economists, by farmer union leaders, by other civil society groups, all of them were ignored for 4 decades, 5 decades. And so now the struggle is actually to get MSP on other crops that are not water guzzling, to actually, you use MSP to create one addiction, and now one has to use that mechanism to avoid risk, to get out of this and to mitigate in some small way this coming climate catastrophe.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tanya and Navyug. We now have a set of questions for Navyug and Professor Gandhi. So I'll read them out. So we have a question from Sanjay Abraham. Could you compare the formation of the Panjab peasantry to that of another Indian or South Asian agrarian region? So, for instance, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Tamil Nadu. In other words, why is this specifically a story about Punjab rather than other South Asian regions? And connected to this is another question by an anonymous attendee. Why is the history of Punjab so bound up with a supposed cultural difference, Panjabian, while that is not the case when we study, I guess, other agrarian states such as Bihar or Odisha, for instance? So that's the first set of questions. Second question is from an anonymous attendee. How deep are the internal differences between districts in Punjab in terms of economy and society? In what sense is Punjab internally uneven? And finally, almost 80 years after partition, how have Indian Punjab and Pakistani Punjab developed differently with respect to economy and society? So, Professor Gandhi, would you like to take these first and then have Navyug?
These are excellent questions, of course. What about any fundamental differences between Punjabi peasant society and peasant life, and peasant society, peasant economies in other parts of the subcontinent? There are obviously clear differences. And these differences, to my limited understanding, are connected to geographical realities, water realities, also historical realities. Punjab has seen movement of people from Afghanistan, from Middle East, Central Asia, which some other parts of the subcontinent have not seen. All these make for significant differences in many aspects of life, including agricultural life. So that is a good point that has been made, and it should be acknowledged freely. I am very interested in the question about the Indian Panjab and Pakistani Panjab. Of course, Indian Panjab was divided into three, into what we now call Panjab and what we now call Himachal, what we now call Haryana. All these three portions are part of what was the British period, eastern part of undivided Punjab. One enormous reality about the two parts of Punjab is that even basic information about the immediate neighbor is not known. I don't think many people in today's India or in today's Pakistan would know that just before partition in August of 47, for instance, in Amritsar city, 47% were Muslims. That Jalandhar and Ludhiana cities had actually Muslim majorities. That Lahore had at least 30% Hindu and Sikh population. That Rawalpindi had a very large Sikh and Hindu population. But today, knowledge about even information that this was so is completely missing. So Lahore and Amritsar, yes, it was not easy to move from one city to the other within a day, talking about the 40s. But they were intimately connected in culture, in economy, in so many other ways. And we also all know that when people left one part of Punjab for the other, many of them thought that this was only a temporary departure. So the rupture, the disruption, the total separation is a very real thing, but it's not something that you would say is a natural thing or was an inevitable thing, desirable thing. We have to accept the reality. But I, from the question, the very good question asked, I would say that encouragement in the study of the neighboring Punjab in Pakistan, about Indian Punjab and Indian Haryana, Indian Himachal, in Indian Punjab about Pakistani Punjab, if we can do that not only on scholarly level and graduate level, top universities, but we can even encourage that in high schools and undergraduate courses. So that kind of curiosity about the neighboring Punjab, factual information about the neighboring Punjab, and then some even exchange of information, exchange of people, making it easier to travel even. Those are the possibilities that I derive from this very important question. So I will stop with that.
Yeah. Yeah, let me quickly touch on these questions again. Another very excellent set. I think it's to the first question about comparing Punjab to other regions, or why is the history of Punjab so bound up with cultural differences, unlike elsewhere? So it's very difficult to say which other regions one could compare to. I mean, that's maybe for readers to decide. If you read a history of Maharashtra or Bihar or Orissa, and you think it speaks to these questions, one can put them together. We mentioned Rupa's work on Tamil Nadu. Tariq Ali worked on Bengal. Asim Akhtar and Mubashir Rizvi, anthropologists working on West Punjab. And there's all sorts of wonderful scholars who are doing that work. But I think what actually comes across is the generic figure of the Indian peasant might not be tenable. That upon closer examination, it doesn't hold up. There is no way, I think, to, with actually any substance, speak of the Indian peasant writ large, that these regions are actually very, very important. I mean, there's more people in India than there is in all of Europe. And we would never talk about the European peasant. We know every specificity of Italian pasta and Belgian chocolate and French wine, and yet we have Indian food, right? So actually the regions and the regional histories and specificities matter. If I'm invoking the cultural difference of Panjabi history to speak about the peasant, I think the best works on Madhya Pradesh or Bihar or Kerala actually invoke that cultural history too. That they actually draw on that, on those details to show the specificity of those regions. So maybe the question then can be posed back to actually rethink these larger framings, these national categories, and actually undo some of that inheritance. To the other question, the second question about differences in the districts, absolutely. I mean, this is part of that fine-grained analysis. You have, currently now 3 regions, I guess, in Punjab, Majha, Malwa, Doaba, and British rule actually figures in where and how these histories are shaped to an extent, because the pre-colonial Maharaja Ranjit Singh's kingdom extended to the kind of Satluj River, and south of it, which was Malwa, was ruled by different kingdoms that eventually aligned with the British. And so there's a kind of distinctive history there. And then that plays into things like where sugarcane is grown versus where cotton is grown. It has to do with topography and access to water. And it also then plays a role in shaping migration patterns. People from Doaba, smaller landholdings, migrated earliest and in larger numbers. People in Malwa and northern parts of Majha much later. So actually the district-wide differences are important, and one needs to pay attention to them. The last point about Punjab, East and West, I would echo exactly what Rajmohan ji said. There's obviously this underlying connection. This is one broader region, connections of history, of language, of clothing, of music, of food, all of that is there. There are efforts, I would say, long-standing efforts, but even recently, to overcome some of the bigotry and division and ignorance using platforms like this, like online platforms where people are getting together and reciting music or poetry. People are meeting relatives long lost through video connections. The Kartarpur corridor has created new possibilities of interaction. But we also shouldn't, again, deny how 70 years or 74, 75 years have shaped actually different trajectories and have made the situation, I think, in East and West Punjab quite different. Remember, in East Punjab is a small state in a large country called India. And 2.5% of the landmass, 2% of the population. On the other side of the border, Punjab is the largest state in a once severed country. And something like 65% of the country is Punjab. And I think that's shaped things like military recruitment and canal colonies and allocation of state resources. Just to give one example, we have this phenomenon where Punjabis in West Punjab, especially in the cities and elites, have forsaken their language for Urdu through a state project of marking difference and Islamicization, however one wants to read that. There's efforts to undo this, and there are challenges to it, but by and large, that's kind of shaped things in a profound way. You don't see that in the East in East Punjab. Now there is the tensions between Hindi and Punjabi, and that long history of linguistic divides and the kind of differences that produced. But I think we are still living actually with the tragedy of 1947, and I see a constant tension between connections, but actually disconnections. And maybe the one sort of positive note I'll end on is most of this is thrown into relief and in fact undone when Punjabis meet in the diaspora. And that is where actually the first things one says is literally for East Punjabi or West Punjabi is you denounce the governments and the politicians and you invoke the kind of commonality of people. And I think that maybe gives us perhaps the most hope.
Thanks, Navyug. So I think we have time for just a few more questions, and I think it'd be great if Tanya, Navyug, and Professor Gandhi could respond to these and make their kind of closing comments. So the first question is from Amin Ashfaq, who asks, what would the history of Punjabi agricultural labor rather than peasants look like? In this regard, how is the seasonal migration of Bihari, Eastern UP, and other agricultural workers to Punjab since the 1970s shaped Punjabi agrarian society, including between Punjabi Dalits who were/are engaged in agrarian labor and these migrants? That's the first question. The second question is again by Amin. Aren't there internal differences within the Punjab peasantry in terms of peasantry/agrarian labor, large/small holders, those in wheat growing and those in cotton growing regions? And the final question is, what has been the impact of out-migration from the early 20th century onward to Great Britain, the USA, and also to a lesser extent East Africa and Southeast Asia on shaping the economic basis of agriculture in Punjab and Punjab and I think other Indian regions. So maybe, Tanya, if you'd like to start, you're welcome to take any of these questions or provide any closing comments as you can.
Okay. I think probably Navyug and Rajmohan ji have more sort of erudite comments to make on these questions. I think I'll just maybe address one of this and refer you to Navyug's wonderful book to get the best kind of answer to this, which is, kind of thinking about differentiation within the peasantry. And I think that's really the point of Navyug's book is really to show us how there are these differentiations which often get elided when we sort of focus on this kind of singular figure of the caste-based peasant. And therefore, we need to, I think, have more granular sort of complex studies of the many different kinds of people who work in agriculture in many different ways, and the different kinds of labor, including across caste and gender, and the different kinds of groups of people who are engaged in cultivation in a broader sense, and the ways in which I think also, as the question notes, kind of thinking about the differences that different crops, different regions, and so on make also to how labor is organized and how inequalities come to emerge. So I would just say read Navyug's excellent book, and I think you will, and I hope that many more scholars take up these questions in different regions and kind of show us with the granularity that Navyug has shown how these kind of internal differences take shape.
Okay, thank you, Tanya. So, Professor Gandhi, would you like to speak to any of these questions or provide any concluding remarks?
It's obvious that certainly Indian Punjab has changed in dramatic ways in the last 75 years or so after independence and partition. Indian Punjab has shrunk. Indian Punjab has, as one of the questioners pointed out, now so many people from Bihar and UP who are not necessarily always there, but who are there much of the year. So that has been a very big, you might say, transformation on the Indian side. As far as Pakistani Punjab is concerned, as Navyug has pointed out, unlike Indian Punjab, it is the dominant part of Pakistan. It's there in the army, it's there in business, politics. Punjabis of Pakistan, and of course, many more speak Panjabi, even though Navyug is right, there is this attempt by some to substitute Urdu for Punjabi. But that hasn't been all that successful. And many more people speak Punjabi in Pakistan than they speak in India. Punjabi is more in Pakistani language today than an Indian language. And so that is one dramatic difference. The two Punjabs. In one case, there's a rise to power. In another case, there is a diminution. I mean, that is an effect. I look for, of course, today's realities are very hard and very discouraging in many ways. But certainly in other parts of the world, if not necessarily within India, within Pakistan, but there is a chance for Punjabi scholars or scholars of Punjab from the subcontinent who are in other parts of the world, for them to do some research together, some joint studies. It'll be a wonderful thing in Canada or Australia or UK, US, for some scholars who've come from Pakistan and some from India to do some studies together. And of course, the same thing applies, by the way, to the eastern part, to Bengal. That's completely different, not part of our discussion today. But my goodness, the incredible stories of both parts of Bengal. All I say is let us not be too dissuaded by current difficulties. Let us at least intellectually imagine some projects for the future, for some joint studies and a broad study of both Punjabs and indeed of both Bengals. So I'll conclude with that.
Thank you so much, Professor Gandhi. Navyug, closing remarks?
Yeah, let me just briefly respond. I'll just say to Amin's questions. Absolutely, I think that the question of the agricultural laborer and the peasant is intertwined. I mean, that's part of what my book is trying to do, is to show them as simultaneous, their emergence. Now, if you're talking about contemporary situations, yes, I think there's a lot of anthropological work, economists work on migrants from Bihar and UP and elsewhere performing agricultural labor, seasonal migrant laborers. Just glance at any issue of EPW and you'll find people that have done really serious, patient, detailed work on this. So I can direct you towards that one resource. To the other question about the differences within the peasantry, yes, again, this is something I try to emphasize, that it's not a homogeneous category, that even within the so-called Panjabi peasant, there are differences between land ownership, between the kinds of crops grown. There's internal friction. Just one instance in the book is all of the question about the peasant versus the moneylender. The colonial officials actually had to confront the phenomenon of the peasant who lends money. What do you do with that? Because they're agriculturalists, they're an agricultural tribe, but they're swallowing up other agriculturalists. Now what? How do you intervene in that? And so I think that kind of shows a kind of the role of a class implicated in caste playing out in a kind of economy that's changing in the 20th century. The last point about outmigration. Yes, absolutely. I think that outmigration has shaped the fate of Punjab. I should note, though, that the largest group of migrants coming to the US are Telugu speakers from Andhra and Gujaratis. And Punjabis are number 3. They're the third category. They get maybe most of the attention, but it's actually people from other regions that are coming to the US, at least in very large numbers. In addition to what everyone else has said, I would just say that I think this kind of migration has allowed the state to avoid its own responsibilities. It's allowed the Indian state to, it's let it off the hook. Because if you imagine tens of thousands, actually hundreds of thousands of young people remaining in India, remaining in Punjab, they would demand jobs, they would demand civil services, they would demand healthcare, education, they would demand changes to society. And I think by allowing one way or another this kind of outflow, the state has kind of lessened its own responsibility. And I think that those days are coming to an end. And I think we're going to have to confront real questions of social and economic change within India when the kind of outlet of migrants is no longer available. But to take Rajmohanji's point really to heart, I think in these despairing times, we must kind of envision alternatives, think of emancipatory horizons, renew our kind of commitment to each other and to the future. And I think this conversation is maybe emblematic of that. To have such generous colleagues is really an immense privilege. So thank you all.
Thank you, Navyug, Tanya, and Professor Gandhi for a wonderfully productive discussion.